discussion on the strategic CPO, managing risk, and the board. So just, low stakes. We're here today. I'm Rachel Wallace. I'm the membership director for the Data Privacy Board, which is a community where data privacy leaders at the world's biggest companies get actionable advice and unbiased insights from their peers. I'm joined today by a very distinguished group of leaders in this space, and I am sure you're excited to hear what they have to share. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we're just going to move right into our conversation. I'm just going to have you go around in the order that you're on my screen. So Sandeep, would you start us off? Give us a little quick intro to who you are.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. So Sandeep Amar, I'm from MSCI, and I head up privacy, data protection, and a few other bits and pieces as well, but we'll focus on privacy and data protection for today.
Awesome. And Peter, what about you?
Hi, folks. A quick thank you to Privado for bringing us all together for this discussion today. I've been fortunate in my privacy career to work for a federal government consumer protection agency, for a law firm, and also in-house doing privacy work. And so I bring that to the experience, and I'm looking forward to sharing with everybody else today.
Thanks, Peter. And Stuart.
Hi, everybody. Stuart Lee. I'm VP of Privacy and Third-Party Risk Management at Korn Ferry. Prior to Korn Ferry, I was with VMware for just under 6 years, and then a career in consulting, which took me around the world a few times, getting everyone ready for GDPR. So excited to be here and to share the panel.
Excellent. So glad to have you all here today. We're going to get right into it because I'm sure there's lots of questions that people have and there's good information to be shared. Before we do get started, I just wanted to note that for all of our panelists today, the opinions they're sharing are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of their companies or even previous companies. I'm sure you all know that, but we like to just say it. So we'll get right into that. Today, we're talking about managing risk and the board, and there's so much going on, so much risk, so much change. So I'm just kind of curious, starting there, how do you feel like leadership's view of privacy risk has changed, maybe compared to 5 years ago? What's new and different? And we can have anybody kick us off. Maybe Stuart, I know you're interested in this topic, so why don't you start us off, and then we'll go around.
Sure. Certainly privacy is one of those topics that touches every area of the business. So the view of risk has inherently changed as well. I think at first it was about getting ready for what laws are coming down the road. How are we making sure that the organization is in the right place, putting in the foundations of that program? We're now shifting to a lot more of a forward-focusing look. How are we proactively working with our business team to think about how they're using data, what products are they looking to bring to market, et cetera. And then, of course, new and emerging technologies. The CPO, the privacy leader, they have to wear a lot of different hats as they're working through everything they do with the business. And I'm sure we're going to talk about AI. I'm sure we're going to talk about AI a lot. But certainly as we think about the emerging risk in that area, the ethical use of data beyond just privacy, that is another interesting piece that's really come through over the past 5 years. But certainly the role of the CPO has significantly changed, not just from that, hey, you can't, or hey, you got to think about these kind of things, to a strategic partner, but now it's really becoming that interdisciplinary person working across the business.
Absolutely. Sandeep, any follow-up to that? Other comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with everything that Stuart certainly said there. I think for me, the scope is very much broader. I think, when the role of the CPO was, kind of first out there, for me, it was very much about being aligned to general counsel. And that was the real focus, ultimately just focused on the regulation and the interpretation of the regulation. So, I've seen kind of a lot more focused on increased collaboration. It's those touch points that Stuart referenced with the business stakeholders at every avenue. And, the scope also extending to have that in-depth technological expertise, whether you're talking about, kind of data encryption and which keys and methodologies to use, or whether you're talking about ad tech, as we were kind of, on one of the previous sessions. So it's that much broader scope. Those are probably the key things for me.
And I think to echo what Stuart and Sandeep have said, one of the things that has increasingly changed as you look at the laws that are emerging around the world, as well as existing laws, is there's increased accountability. And so instead of having sort of a sort of plausible deniability approach, I'll say, to privacy, where if you have the right contract language and you pick the right subcontractors, the right vendors, you can insulate yourself somewhat. There's two things that have really changed. The first is you can no longer escape that downstream liability. And in fact, we're seeing laws that say you need to actually do due diligence, not just say you have the right to, but actually do it throughout the life of a transaction with a contractor, a vendor. But the other piece is accountability has really changed. It used to be organizational accountability, and now we're starting to see laws that have individual liability up to and including criminal liability. And so I think that's been a real wake-up call. And I think the real danger to those wake-up calls is that it can escalate privacy to a different level of risk. And so I think when we talk about working with C-suites, when we talk about working with boards, part of what we need to talk about is remembering that privacy is a risk, but not the only risk.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a good point, Peter.
Public awareness and trust, I think, is kind of, front of mind, to the risk that Peter's kind of been talking about there. So it's top of mind for corporations and consumers. So it is, commonplace to be discussing these issues. So yeah, that's the big thing.
Good points. In that same vein, I'd love to maybe switch to a little bit about when you're looking at sort of balancing those risks, like you have these, they're coming from various places. How then does that translate to building some of those effective C-suite partnerships within your organization? So if you're looking at working with your CTO or your CISO, like where do you think that there's the most opportunity for people to strengthen those relationships, work on these sorts of issues with one another? Maybe I'll throw back to you, Peter, since that was kind of what you had raised, but I'd love to hear from everybody.
Sure. So I think one of the things that is increasingly apparent, and I think both Sandeep and Stuart have sort of flagged this, is that privacy is no longer a standalone function. There used to be sort of the good old days where you had very clear definitions of privacy and it was very technical, and companies could and did say, we don't really have privacy risks. I think now every company is a data company. Every company in some way is working with personal data, and every company is working across jurisdictions. And so I think with that comes an increased emphasis on risk management and information governance. And so what that means is, as a privacy professional, you need to be able to cross those lines. You need to recognize who the parties are that you work with and the stakeholders, and it needs to be a collaborative undertaking. And for me, that really translates into having an organization-wide picture of risk so that everybody knows what the risk tolerance is and everybody feels responsibility for it.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to make everybody look good is always appreciated across the board. So you think about some of the lessons learned over the past 5, 6, 7 years. Who else would we have brought to the table back in 2016 when we were talking about GDPR? Who else would we have brought to the table now when we're talking about AI? And being able to have those close working relationships to say, we get this right now, we're going to save you this much of time and energy and effort down the road. I think that's where you can really get some of that effective partnership. What is your roadmap? What data are you going to be looking to collect? What are the strategic jurisdictions we're going to be moving into as a business? You're shifting yourself from being hey, what are the requirements, to let me build the roadmap with you. And I think very much echoing what Peter was saying there, being able to read the horizon with the team, being able to learn from those lessons, showing that you're able to actually move the business forward with privacy as a differentiator. We're not just talking about trust as a tongue-in-cheek thing that we should be talking about. It's actually, we're really doing it. That for me, I think, is where you can build those effective relationships. And then ultimately you get to sit together at the audit committee, at the board, and share the journey you've been on. Show that you really added value to the organization, rather than just talking about privacy being a cost basis of what you're doing.
Always the struggle, right? Sandeep.
Yep, and I guess to echo one of the points that Peter made about every company being a data company, I think that'll be a common trend. I mean, if anyone reads proxy statements in the same way that I do, you will see that the privacy risks, the data risks, the cyber risks are all very much forefront for everyone to kind of be talking about, and those risks are obviously relevant for any company that has any degree of data, whether it's customer data, internal data, it's very much an active risk for them. And I think from a privacy perspective, that risk management is very much integrated within business strategy. It's about understanding what the business's objectives actually are and managing that risk to enable that business change, that transformation, whatever the objectives and strategy are.
Absolutely. In that same vein of having, the different groups presenting together and showing how you're working together, I'm curious what metrics you found to be particularly effective, especially when you're talking about presenting things on an executive level. I assume there's quite a bit of overlap there. So I'm curious which ones have seemed to resonate the best when you've seen presentations and such. Or which ones maybe would you advise people to steer clear of too? If there's any that you're like, don't share those. We want to hear those too. Let's go first to Sandeep. I don't think I've made you go first, so you might be next.
Oh gosh, okay. I guess in terms of risks, I mean, for me, it's really about making it quantifiable. First of all, I mean, what we want to move away from is where we were when GDPR was in its infancy, just focusing on the fines. It's more trying to make this quantifiable, and a good approach that I like to use is really taking it back to kind of process maturity. So, things like the NIST privacy framework have been pretty useful in actually doing that, and then overlaying it with kind of CMM, so you can actually have a scorecard route to actually tackling your maturity challenges. That's something that I've used in a few organizations and seen some real benefit in actually demonstrating progress. And actually, again, aligning that to business objectives.
Mm.
And
yeah,
go
ahead.
I'll do Peter first, and then Stuart. One here for both of you.
So two things. One of the things that has, I think, really started happening, particularly over the past few years, is privacy engineering, which is trying to bridge some of the gaps between these kind of inchoate privacy principles on the one hand and the hard metrics that Sandeep was talking about. And so I think starting to really be able to translate what are those kind of gray area principles is really helpful with metrics. And I'll be slightly impolitic here and say that I think a really important metric for anyone who's part of a privacy team in an organization is how many things are you doing that don't require specific costs only for privacy. In other words, are you leveraging existing solutions, existing data, existing systems, existing tools? The more you can do that, the more you're helping both with information governance and sort of synchronized risk management. And that's really, I think, the direction that things need to be moving in.
And to build on what everyone's saying here, and Rachel, thinking about your question, for me, the metrics have had to be across different tiers. So you've got to show that your program is working. So are you doing the things that you're supposed to be doing to help drive compliance within the organization, as well as enable the organization? You need to show the risk management side of things. And that doesn't just need to be necessarily, we've identified 16 different types of risks or whatever, but it can really show where you've driven value into the organization there. And the final one for your executive staff is the value. If you're showing your board, we've fulfilled 25 DSARs this year, I think you've lost them. I think you really need to be able to show your board is where you've actually added value to the organization. You've accelerated the deal cycle. The contract time with your customers has been reduced. Perhaps if you've been in a tough spot in the past, the number of regulatory conversations you've had to have, something that's actually going to hit them where they really, really care about. The final thing I would say is you can also make metrics fun. If you're working with a large organization, you have a lot of different teams that are working with privacy. You can actually gamify the process. You can actually work with across the board to say, hey, this team is actually doing some stuff that's really mature. Why aren't you? Why can't you meet that need as well? And so never underestimate the competitiveness of people, particularly in the technology space, to want to be better. So metrics, measure what matters, measure what shows value, and make it fun.
And if I could just pick up on what Stuart just said, I think the other thing that's really important for a privacy team is to demystify privacy. In other words, it's sort of got this hands-off, nobody wants to touch it because it's kind of the third rail. And so I think when we talk about metrics, we also want to talk about what does the privacy team do to make it accessible. And that's, training, that's change management, that's a whole host of issues. And the other piece is it's about empowerment. A lot of privacy is fairly straightforward. We've got teams that are very, very good at assessing other business risks. And so part of what privacy can do is help them recognize basic risks and know when to escalate. And I think all of those go to what Stuart is saying about how do you add value rather than simply being a bottleneck.
Absolutely. This is a great segue into what I wanted to kind of shift a little bit into next, which is sort of like, as you have these incredibly ambitious initiatives that are being proposed for business or whatever else, how are you, as the person who is responsible for making sure that privacy concerns are taken into consideration at the right times? Can you maybe share an example of that? Is that something that's come up with you? And it doesn't have to be from your current place. It can be a previous one, but I'd just be very interested to know a time in which you really had to balance this ambitious and business initiative with something that was also had some significant privacy concerns that you had to raise.
Yeah, I think whenever you're looking to launch a new product, whenever you're looking to take advantage of a new technology that everyone's still kind of grappling to fully understand, that privacy balance comes into play. The first part I think we all talked about at the beginning is being in that conversation from day one. Even when you're drawing it on the back of a napkin, what are you thinking of doing? What are the technologies you're thinking of using? What are the privacy risks that I'm not even really thinking about here? But one of the great opportunities with privacy is that because we do think bigger, we don't just think about privacy compliance, we think about the ethical use of data, which is why many of us, when AI came along, were the first people to put up our hands and get involved, was because we've been trained to think about the use of data rather than just the protection of data. And I think that's an important consideration here. So, some of those techniques is being that trusted advisor, being able to have that broader conversation of what are the other things I need to think about just beyond privacy compliance. But
oh no, did we lose Stuart for just a second?
Yeah, he's frozen there.
We'll come back, and I'm sure it's really good whatever he was going to say. So we'll see him again. But Sandeep, please hop in.
Yeah, I suppose building on the lineup there that Stuart really gave us there.
Solution.
Just
one second. We'll come back to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's Sandeep finish that thought, and we're going to come back to you, Stuart, because we lost you for just a second. So let's let Sandeep go.
Yeah, so kind of building on the points that Stuart made, and it's that kind of broader thinking and understanding the needs and the motivations for whatever the business objective is, and being able to analyze that, provide a different perspective, because as Stuart kind of indicated, from a privacy perspective, we are thinking much more holistically. We are thinking about the risks. We are thinking about the data overall, and being able to actually, say, is there another way to actually solve this? Can we still meet the same objective by maybe reducing some of the risk and, making some adjustments?
Absolutely. Stuart, back to you. We cut you mid-sentence. Was there anything you wanted to make sure we got in terms of points?
Sandeep did it perfectly and said it much more articulately. So privacy by design kicking me off. But no, thank you.
No, not at all. Peter, please.
And I think just to pick up on where Sandeep left off, everyone is doing some form of data analytics now. It's important whether you're talking about events, whether you're talking about online presence, marketing, advertising, or you're talking about surveys and data analysis and creating data lakes that you can then use to derive understanding and monetize data, as it were. One of the things that does is it brings you into conflict with laws of different jurisdictions. We've talked about what it means to operate across laws. And that gets back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the importance of knowing what the organization's tolerance for risk is. Because really the job of someone in privacy is to be a facilitator, as Sandeep and Stuart have both said. You need to be able to look at all the different pieces and then kind of chart a path through. And the value you can create is by being able to say, yes, but, and that may include doing things like navigating laws that contradict each other, because guaranteed no organization wants to be told you do this a different way in every single jurisdiction you operate in. And so that really requires the ability to not just marry sort of the risk culture and the risk tolerance, but to be able to see the big picture and then talk to the other folks about how you navigate into that. And so I think that's, whether you're talking about AI, you're talking about a global employer who's collecting personal data around the globe and centralizing it, or you're talking about an event organization. All of those need to be able to navigate that. And privacy, it's very easy to say no. It's harder to say, here's how we get there.
Yeah, try to be more of the yes people. We love to hear it. Peter, I'm going to start with this question for you, but I want everybody to answer it as well, since we're talking about risk, which is kind of looking towards that. What's emerging that you think in terms of trends or risks that ought to be, on people's radars as CPOs? What do you think those biggest challenges are? You just, casual 8 minutes left. No worries. You're gonna get it all.
Sure. I think one of the things that can get lost in the shuffle when we talk about AI and we talk about the latest and greatest technology is we're really talking about basic principles. We're talking about basic organizational principles, information governance principles, and there's lots of extra bells and whistles, but those bells and whistles really can be boiled down to really simple concepts of privacy, security, and data risk management. I think the risk going forward is as regulators try to develop laws to address issues real and imagined, and companies try to navigate that, there's a real risk of finger pointing. And I think we've seen this with certain incidents. And I think looking at privacy and data risk management as a company activity, a company responsibility, board, C-suite, everybody involved, accords it the level of seriousness it needs in order to be able to navigate pretty much anything that happens, whether it's new technology. And so I think the risk is forgetting that each organization that plays in this pool needs to be able to have a coherent story to tell and basically their own privacy program. You can't really take external laws. You have to actually figure out how do they apply to me and what is our story going to be.
Stuart or Sandeep, what do you think in terms of emerging risk? What do you see as your biggest challenges going forward? It doesn't have to be you specifically. It can be broad, but I am curious.
Well, I guess the obvious one is obviously AI, and we're all thinking about that. We're all actively involved in that. I think the things for me, it's more about the proliferation of new requirements, and so new regulatory requirements. We're expecting obviously a lot more change. And I suppose also the kind of convergence between privacy regulation and more kind of data and cyber regulation. So DORA has kind of just come in. We've got new requirements related to cyber incident reporting in the US. The SEC announced those last year. The convergence of all of these requirements and actually managing the myriad of these requirements as a global organization, particularly when you've got global data sets, managing, first of all, the implementation of these requirements within your organization, but then if you have an incident, actually, managing the requirements associated with reporting.
I think to build up on top of what everyone said, but from a slightly different angle, one, we continue to see the absence of resources that we all need, both in terms of getting those resources into the business, but finding the folks that can help us. It has grown, which is great, but we still need more. Second, I think there is the increased obligation and burden upon privacy leaders. We've mentioned, obviously, AI, we've mentioned the increasing laws, but I'm seeing more and more privacy leaders taking on other responsibilities, third-party risk management, data governance in particular. That's a real risk to all of us in this field of how do we actually kind of continue to scale what we do. And then finally, I think it's the conversation at the board level. Privacy we see as a strategic risk, but how do you keep the board engaged on it? Security has done a pretty good job. We can learn from them, but we've got to make sure that we're always making sure we're keeping the board aware of where we're really moving to for the long term.
Perfect. We have a few minutes left, and I know that there are a lot of people watching who are probably aspiring CPOs, right? People who have this on their roadmap for their career. And so as people who have sat in this role, I'm curious, what advice would you give? Either based on career trajectories or just even current circumstances to someone who is gunning for one of those CPO roles, both now or in the future?
I'll take it.
Start with Peter.
I think the first and most important thing for everybody to know is there are a lot of different paths to a CPO. There's no particular background that's magic. There's no particular piece. I think it's really a mindset. And I think that mindset has to be risk-based. It's, as I said earlier, it's very easy to say no. It's much harder to say yes, but. And I think just being aware of risk and figuring out how to navigate and being confident enough to sort of tell the story. And then on a really simplistic level, I'll say, however high you get in an organization, it's important to be able to ask what other people might consider dumb questions, because there are a lot of assumptions that get made for convenience. And you really need to be able to test those, including what people think personal data is and why somebody might say, for example, we're not working with personal data, so we don't really need to talk about this project. So that's pretty straightforward.
I love it. No, it's one of my favorite questions to ask people is, how did you end up in this job? Because it's never the same. It's always a very, very windy path. Sandeep, what about you? What's inspiring advice you would give?
I guess, I'm just thinking about the winding path that I've had to this particular role. But I think for me, it is about being able to actually think about more than just one kind of base skill set. It's about the technical background. It's about legal background. It's about being hungry to learn. I think that is something that has always worked well for me, and I'm sure it's worked well for both Stuart and Peter. You have to have that breadth of knowledge and be able to talk in the language of your stakeholders. So it's engaging with your business stakeholders and being able to break down what your expectations are for them to meet a particular requirement, or to, whether it's privacy by design or you've got a new reporting requirement, whatever it may be, and find your allies. That is a key one. I think that's probably relevant whether you're a CISO, a CPO, or a CTO. You need to find your allies. There will always be stakeholders that are going to value what you're doing. Marketing is generally a good place to kind of go for that. HR as well. Go where the data is what I would say.
Stuart, we have 30 seconds. Any last thoughts? We want to make sure we don't leave you out for our aspiring CPOs.
Thank you. Yeah, echoing what everyone else has already said, invest in yourself, invest in the time, embrace technology, embrace that this is going to be a continually evolving field, and hang on for the ride, because I do think it's one of the most entertaining leadership roles you can possibly have.
Hear, hear.
Excellent last words. Thank you all so much. I know there's been an incredible breadth of expertise, and so I would also encourage anybody who's an aspiring CPO is to continue to seek out leaders like you all, because you have great advice to offer, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share it. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for our host for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel, for writing her on this.
Anytime.